Welcome. It's my real pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Financing the Future We Want, and it's the official launch of the INFF facility. Really excited to have with us today a high-level panel to really talk to us about this important topic and really dive into how countries can finance recovery from the pandemic and accelerated progress towards the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. We're going to hear from national policymakers and leaders of international organizations about how countries are using these integrated national financing frameworks, or INFFs, to finance the future that we want or need moving forward. We're going to officially launch the INFF Facility, which is a partnership between UNDP, UN DESA, the OECD, the European Commission, Sweden, and Italy. My name is Adva Saldinger. I'm a journalist at DevEx, where I cover development finance and write our weekly newsletter called DevEx Invested. Shameless plug here, if you're not signed up for Invested, I suggest you do. I try to keep on top of all the latest that's happening in the development finance space. For more information on the INFFs themselves and the INFF facility, you can visit the INFF Knowledge Platform, which is at www.inff.org. You will see in your chat some links, and you can also follow the Knowledge Platform on Twitter, which is @INFF Platform. To start us off, I am very glad to be able to welcome Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, who's going to frame our discussion for us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Real pleasure to welcome everyone to the official launch of the Integrated National Financing Frameworks, our INFFs. INFFs were first introduced in Addis Ababa Action Agenda in 2015, and these were meant to provide tools to financing the country's sustainable development strategies. We knew then that without financing, the SDG plans would remain a vision rather than a vehicle for change. INFFs are helping countries incorporate financing in national planning and try to ensure that all financing policies are meant to advance the realization of the SDGs. They also prepare countries to deal with the complexity and unpredictability. In this moment of multiple and cascading crises, a strategic and risk-informed approach to financing recovery is really indispensable. And so here, INFFs are a powerful tool. First, they help countries to better understand their needs by measuring finance gaps and identifying impediments to investments. And by doing so, countries' priorities, policy measures for mobilizing additional resources are met. This includes revenue strategies to raise public resources and financial sector development strategies and investment plans to raise private resources. INFFs also are a tool for designing strategic frameworks to help strengthen the impact of development cooperation. Second, they enhance coherence across different financing policies so that the trade-offs can be better managed and synergies exploited. And third, the INFFs can help countries better manage risk by having a full picture of all financial flows and their interlinkages. A country can easily identify potential risks by focusing on these linkages. These tools can also help to increase resilience to shocks, such as from the climate-related events and pandemics. Fourth, they can make SDG financing much more predictable by tying financing and budgeting to long-term priorities. Countries are already using integrated national financing frameworks to invest in key SDG sectors and are taking forward reforms across public and private finance through many innovations in budgeting, taxation, blended finance, investment promotion, financial sector development, insurance, and many, many other areas. These solutions are designed and implemented through country-led processes, guided by ministries of finance. Already, over 300 financing reforms have been initiated, with 46 countries producing their first SDG-linked financing strategies. As INFF implementation advances, we hear growing demand from countries for technical support. Commitment among partners is also growing. G20 leaders endorsed the G20 framework for voluntary support to INFFs last year. And we're adopting a collaborative and innovative approach to meet these demands. I'm really pleased to announce that UNDESA, UNDP, and OECD are today launching a global integrated national financing framework facility. The facility will bring together INFF activities across partners and provide a joint platform for coordinated support. It will avoid duplication and leverage our efforts. The facility will be both a hub for knowledge sharing and at the global level, and a platform to grow the INFF community at the local level. The United Nations is truly grateful to our partners who have offered support to the facility, Sweden, Italy, and the European Union. I also wish to thank governments that are pioneering the INFFs at the country level in support of the SDGs. Your experiences are providing valuable insights and lessons that we can all learn from and better provide the resources and skill sets that are needed. We are fully committed to continuing this journey with you. I wish us all a fruitful and insightful event and encourage you all to engage actively with the Integrated National Financing Frameworks Facility. Thank you.
Thank you, Amina, for setting the scene so well for us. And it's really, interesting to hear everything you were saying about how momentum behind the INFFs is really building, and the, 300 reforms that are already sort of springing out of this process. And so with so many countries, we're developing these strategies to really look at how they can reform financing for sustainable development. As you said, we're really seeing a demand to learn from the lessons and experiences of other countries as they're going through the process, and to access technical support and guidance. And so it'll be really interesting to see, and it's great that the INFF facility is sort of being developed and launching today to really respond to these needs that countries have said have arisen as this process moves forward. To give us a little bit more context on the INFF facility, we now have a short video.
In 2015, when the world adopted the 2030 Agenda, there was a realization that the Sustainable Development Goals would not only require more investment, it would necessitate a fundamental shift in our financial systems.
It would also require action at the country level to mobilize and align public and private finance with the national development priorities.
To help countries turn these aspirations into reality, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda introduced the concept of integrated national financing frameworks, also known as INFFs. In short, these INFFs
help governments implement strategies and reforms that drive finance towards the SDGs and the objectives of the Paris Agreement.
Since 2015, much progress has been made. Today, more than 80 countries are developing INFF.
Yet in the wake of COVID-19, the amount of financing needed to achieve the SDGs in developing countries has also increased by as much as 70%.
Therefore, supporting INFFs is more important than ever.
That's why the United Nations Development Programme, the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the OECD, the European Union, and the governments of Italy and Sweden have come together to help establish the INFF Facility.
The facility works in three important ways. First, it will respond to country demand for assistance in developing and designing INFF by offering tailored technical support.
Second, the facility will deepen cooperation between public, private, and civil society actors, helping national institutions to deliver inclusive financing strategies and reforms.
Third, the facility will continue to evolve INFF guidance and facilitate learning and exchange between countries.
Ultimately, the INFF facility is about partnerships.
It's about supporting the people working hard to finance the future they want.
A greener, more inclusive,
and a more sustainable future for all.
We invite you to join us.
Well, we're going to have an opportunity to hear from a lot of the folks who you saw in that video just now, because we have an amazing couple set of panels ahead for you today. And I want to just start us off by announcing our first panel who are going to help us to officially launch the facility. So with us, we have Achim Steiner, who's the administrator of the UN Development Program, UNDP, Liu Zhenmin, who's the Under-Secretary-General of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, Jeffrey Schlagenhoff, who's the Deputy Secretary-General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And we have two country speakers. We have from Uzbekistan, which started the INFF process a few years ago and is currently developing a finance strategy. His Excellency, Mr. Ahadbek Haydarov, who's the Deputy Minister of Finance, and representing Ecuador, which is in the earlier stages of developing its INFF, we have His Excellency Bernardo Oriana, the Vice Minister of Finance. So to get us started, I'm going to turn to Achim Steiner, the UNDP Administrator. Achim, today we see that over 80 countries are developing INFFs, and through these processes, they're bringing forward several hundred financing reforms. So tell us a little bit about the current opportunity and why the facility is launching today, why we need to sort of capitalize on this moment, given all the many crises that we face in today's world.
Thank you, Adva. Very good to join you all, Deputy Secretary General, dear colleagues. Let me wind back for a moment to that moment after Rio+20 when the idea of the INFFs were born. As the Deputy Secretary General said, the Addis Ababa agenda set out, in a sense, a platform for shaping a new way of cooperation amongst, first of all, countries themselves to rethink and also recalibrate their financial planning, their financial systems, in order to achieve the kind of investments that would be needed to, in fact, ultimately implement the 2030 agenda. Now, if you wind forward for a moment to before the pandemic hit, I think the ability to design both policy reforms, but also to create a national financing dialogue that would allow the actors from public, private sectors, but also civil society to come around the table and really driven by a national perspective on what are the priorities and how would capital that is available within an economy, but also with partners from outside, be deployed in support of that. That was the intent. Now wind forward to April 2022, and I think the urgency and the crisis context within which we find ourselves post-pandemic in some countries, in the middle of a pandemic in others, and then with everything that's happening around us on global markets right now, the Secretary General's Global Crisis Response Group having drawn attention to the food, fuel, and finance challenges, I think we all realize that we are facing an extraordinary challenge. Countries are not only trying to look at how they can invest forward, which was really the original intent of the INFF, we're actually scrambling to see how we can protect what we have and stabilize economies. So the INFFs initially in 2019 began with about 16 countries to pioneer the approach. And I think the fact that now we have over 80 countries, in fact, engaged in INFF processes is in itself a statement to how critical and acute the challenges are, but also the need. And I think what we have seen, and just this year, 40 of them will complete this process, is precisely the ability to, first of all, rethink how financing and investment in sustainable development, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement being two key cornerstones, but also addressing growing inequality, the fact that countries are losing development gains. All of this requires us to bring to the table the partners that actually can make a difference. And there was a time when we talked about the private elements of the economy as really being driven by a notion of privatization. Today, and the INFFs very much rooted in the paradigm that we want to bring private capital into achieving public good outcomes. And that is why the dialogues, the facility also that is now being put in place, and together with DESA, the OECD, the European Commission, and Sweden and Italy as two launch partners, is precisely coming at the right time, because we need to scale up the support, but we also need to give countries the means by which to introduce rapid policy reforms, scale up a kind of investment amounts that are needed, and above all, leverage private capital, domestic, international, and align it also with the support from international concessional finance, international investors, that will allow countries to weather the storm, but in that storm to be able to invest forward. And so I think what we hopefully can do with the facility is to precisely scale up the support that allows countries to chart their course forward through these very stormy waters.
Thank you, Akram. Next, I'd like to ask Deputy Minister of Finance, Ahadbek Haydarov, to tell us a little bit about why Uzbekistan decided to take on this INFF approach, why it was appealing or attractive, and what sort of challenges and opportunities have you found in that process?
Thank you, Edba, for giving the opportunity to speak in this event. Dear Deputy Secretary General, dear Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you for your invitation and opportunity to speak in this high-level event. During the last 5 years, the government of Uzbekistan has embarked on an unprecedented and ambitious reform agenda. Particularly, the new adopted Uzbekistan development strategy for 2022-2026 paves the path to accelerate growth in economic, social, governance, public, and human development dimensions, and indicates our strong commitment to achieve the SDGs. Our overarching goal for next 5 years is to increase the country's GDP per capita by 1.6 times and to join group of upper middle income countries by 2030. We understand that implementation of reforms and progress toward SDGs require significant financial resources. The state is spending now currently over 70% of its budget on achieving SDGs. According to the last development finance assessment done in 2020, achieving SDGs in Uzbekistan requires additional $6 billion annually. Moreover, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic widened this financing gap. Considering the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, we now face new strains on meeting the SDGs by 2030. Spillovers from trade and supply chain disruptions, reduction of remittances, all investment from Russia, higher food, energy prices, as well as tightening global financial conditions will adversely impact Uzbekistan economic outlook. With this in mind, we continue our work on INFF in Uzbekistan. We expect that the INFF will help us to build a holistic approach for mobilizing public and the private finance and strengthening the dialogue across government, the private sector, and the civil society. As part of INFF process, we're currently elaborating financial strategy to mobilize private and public flows from domestic and external sources and the combined financing policies to increase the overall impact. We are going to introduce innovative financing instruments, including the new sovereign and thematic bonds such as SDG bonds, green bonds, blended finance mechanism, Islamic finance instruments to complement the public development finance. The INFF and the finance strategy will help to tackle such challenges as prioritizing relevant policies and avoiding fragmented decision-making, better aligning national, subnational, and sectoral planning, financing, and monitoring and evaluation frameworks, improving coordination mechanisms, and ensuring that financing instruments and are coherent, sustainable, and risk-informed. We'll continue our close collaboration with UNDP and the UN system in promoting other INFF components, including review and monitoring, as well as governance and coordination mechanism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister. I want to turn next to Lu Jinmin, and what we've just heard is sort of Uzbekistan's experience with the INFF, and it strikes me that there's a lot of lessons to be learned from countries like Uzbekistan who are perhaps farther down the process, who are starting to implement some of these new tools, who have, made it through. So as we look at some of these early implementers and their lessons, how do you think UNDESA's guidance on INFFs can really integrate these country lessons? So moving forward, we can sort of capture and improve the INFF.
Thank you, moderator. Let me join my colleague Akim and Steiner in thanking the Deputy Secretary General for opening remarks, and also thank all our partners in developing this INFF facility and also in launching this INF. Dear colleagues, I think because to follow up comments by my colleague Akim, I think over the past years, the partners, we worked very closely, including DESA, UNDP, OECD, European Union, and Italy, Sweden, as well as in the Bretton Woods institutions. We worked very well. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of them for their excellent collaboration. The INF was designed to facilitate the member states in implementing Addis Ababa agenda. But after we explored the potential of INFF in the 2019 Financial for Sustainable Development Report of the Interagency Task Force, 16 countries committed to pioneer this INFF in September 2019. I think that be after almost 3 years, that really right now, it's good to launch this facility. We have achieved a lot of experience. So, but as a country-led approach to finance national priorities, INF are not a one-size-fits-all approach, but tailored to national context and priorities. So I think, as our colleague from Uzbekistan already indicated, this is they are also learning. So to facilitate the member states, we are also committed to develop our methodological work. So since 2019, DESA has developed a series of tools and guidance to support national efforts in close collaboration with the partners, including UNDP, OECD, and IMF. From outside, these guidance documents were developed drawing on lessons from INFF pioneers and other countries with relevant experiences. So we have put together a step-by-step guidance for all building blocks of the INFF process, including number 1, to carry out financing assessments. Number 2, to develop a financing strategy. Number 3, to set up monitoring and a review mechanism. Number 4, to put in place appropriate governance and coordination mechanism. So this, since release in 2019 and 2021, step by step, these guidance have provided a methodological foundation for INFF implementation at the country level. I think member states appreciate that. So the guidance will continue to be updated based on lessons learned in INFF countries, including from our own country level involvement. So we are not learning from both from country practice, also from our own system practice. We are also working on more tailored guidance to meet growing demand. This includes guidance to countries in special situations, including LDCs and seeds and on climate financing. So this INF facility will allow us to work together even more closely with the colleagues on the ground, ensuring that our joint work responds to the priorities that countries set in their national processes. I think with the reform of our resident coordinator system in the country, I think UN system will continue to coordinate ourselves and lead this process. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to turn next to Jeff Schlagenhoff, the OECD Deputy Secretary General. Jeff, I want to understand how the facility can help OECD DAC members get involved in sort of responding to the demands for technical support as they develop INFFs. We've heard, it's a country level process, but there is a growing demand for additional support. So how do you see the OECD DAC members engaging in the facility?
From our perspective, we think that the facility will fill what is a critical gap in the provision of support to implement the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. The facility will help us pool knowledge and expertise from a broad range of stakeholders, including OECD DAC members, to help developing countries access impartial, quality, and expertise, financial expertise. The facility will contribute to the development and implementation of country-led integrated national financing strategies in developing countries, which OECD DAC members consider a key priority to accelerate advancement towards the SDGs. We view this as increasingly important. We recognize clearly the financing challenges faced by developing countries to achieve the SDGs, especially in light of recent crises. Most developing countries struggle to mobilize sufficient domestic resources and private finance to achieve their long-term development goals. Even before the COVID-19 crisis hit, SDG financing was falling short. At that time, we estimated the gap was about $2.5 trillion per year. And according to our current estimates, we believe that recent crises may have increased that amount by up to 50%. Development cooperation by OECD DAC members plays a key role in the achievement of the 2030 Agenda. Official development assistance provided by DAC members is a crucial, stable component of development finance. The record high volumes of ODA provided by DAC members in 2020 and 2021 are proof to the unwavering commitment that our members have to support the agenda. Yet ODA alone will not be enough to achieve the trillions required to fill the SDG financing gap. That's why the 2015 Addis Ababa Action Agenda called on a broad range of actors, both public and private, to mobilize resources in pursuit of sustainable development. There's a growing paradox in the financing for development landscape. While the new profusion of actors and financing instruments of the SDG era provides opportunities to mobilize more financing, it also adds a layer of complexity and risk. Previous research by the OECD showed that developing countries have more than 1,000 instruments to choose from to finance their development. Through its transition finance work, the OECD has raised the attention of development stakeholders on the importance of helping partner countries navigate this increasingly complex landscape. This means helping them identify the right partners, find the right instruments, and negotiate the best possible terms and conditions for loans. The INFF Facility provides a way for OECD DAC members to connect with these country-led processes and to contribute their technical expertise.
You. I want to turn next to Ecuador and Minister Oriana. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, where Ecuador in this process, and we're in this moment where we're seeing compounding global crises, and I'm curious how you see the financing landscape changing and how Ecuador is feeling this, and how and whether you think the INFF process can help the government really address and adjust to the realities that we see today.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. I think that the landscape in general has changed dramatically, not only because of the pandemic, but also because of what's happening in monetary terms. We're expecting interest rate rises, and in general, we have seen a little more difficulties to go into the markets, not only for I guess companies in rich countries, but especially difficulties for emerging markets. Assigning resources, the allocation of resources it's a little bit more difficult now, because you don't have much space, and especially for Ecuador was tough. We had the GDP decreased like close to 8% the last year, and I'm sorry, 2 years ago, and 2021 we were able to rebound around 4% of GDP. But this is in the context of having a restructuring of our external debt. So although we had some space in the part of trying to increase our financing, there was no much space in reality, since we didn't have market access at that point. So the decrease of the slowing economy is always difficult in terms of revenues that you get from taxes, etc. So it was a very tough environment for us. However, I guess this program really helped us to put a good framework, because designing, when you have very scarce resources, I guess assigning well the cost and identifying the needs, that's a major part, as we did last year, for example, with the vaccination program that was one of the most successful programs in the world. That was also followed by the second part, that articulate and plan very well. I think that's key, because what you see in governments is that nothing is isolated, and the more that you can find synergies in different parts of the government, it's really gonna make a difference. The other part is how mapping resources. I was saying it's difficult when you don't have market access. But the multilateral funds were actually, I guess, our safety net in there, and we really took advantage of that to the fullest extent that we could. But all of that together, you also need to make sure that going forward, you need to put a governance system in place in order to have efforts that will not be lost in the future. But I think if putting that into the context, I guess after the vaccination process of the last year and an economy that is healing, hopefully we will recover the levels that we had pre-pandemic at the end of this year. We're having a little bit more interest in the financial markets. Investors are coming to visit Ecuador. And I think in general, we see a sort of like an easier or easier financial constraints going forward. And you also have to be smart, because I think, for example, if you take into account the sustainable objectives that the country also has a very good appetite in terms of how can you find financing. As we put in the ministry, we even have started to train some of the people, because we believe that there's a lot of chance to have, we call it a multicolor financing, either for women or green financing or for different places. So we have sort of color code that, and I think that's a tremendous opportunity going forward.
I like that sort of framing, that you need to sort of address all those different types. I'm going to come back to you in just a couple of minutes to learn a little bit more about Ecuador's experience. I want to turn back to Achim Steiner, and Achim, I want to, we heard a little bit about sort of the role of being able to bring in capital and access to capital from Minister Orellana, and sort of that investors are starting to express interest again. What role do you think INFFs can play in bringing together these different stakeholders, both sort of across ministries within a government, but also really across the public and private sector? And how is UNDP looking at sort of facilitating some of that coordination or cooperation process in country? And what do you envision as sort of the role of the facility that we're launching today to support some of that coordination?
Thank you, Adu. I think our colleagues have already spoken to some of the examples, and I think what is critical in understanding the INFFs is that in the first instance, it creates a platform, and very critical to this platform is the notion of inclusiveness and of getting participation by all those who are able to influence either domestic capital flows or international. Now, obviously, the building of that platform is just a step. It's a means to an end. And in the first instance, I think, led by ministries of finance and planning, it is a way in which government can more coherently define the link between investment, capital requirements, and national development priorities. Very often, as we know, when crises turn to the international financial system, they do so in moments of crisis. At that point, they are essentially narrowing their thinking to how to solve an immediate crisis, how to borrow money. The INFF is meant to be a by design approach that allows countries to bring together capital requirements with national policy priorities. Secondly, by being inclusive, it really does also bring to the table much more the chambers of commerce, banking federations, investors networks, the insurance sector, small, medium-scale enterprises, and civil society, parliamentarians, and international partners. And I think, we may deem that to be something that is obvious, but in reality, that does not always happen, and very often, in fact, happens very imperfectly. So these inclusive approaches are a first critical part, I think, of making INFFs provide a value added. Secondly, we are also all learning together. As Lu Jimin said just now, we as UNDP or DESA or international partners, we bring some of the experience, we bring some of the templates, the methodology, but really it is a process led by countries, and very quickly innovations from within countries emerge. We heard the Deputy Minister in Uzbekistan speak, and Uzbekistan did a remarkable thing with raising an SDG bond last year. Cabo Verde raised its Blue X platform, the world's first blue economy sustainable financing platform. Colombia's SDG corporate tracker, where more than 300 companies are reporting on their contributions to the SDGs, and many other such innovations are emerging. So I think the second part is really, it is a fast forward, open source learning platform that allows ultimately a strategy to emerge that is inclusive and has constituencies, including by agreeing what are the incentives that would allow private capital to invest in national development processes. Thirdly, we are also seeing that many reform proposals will come up. The Deputy Secretary-General referred to it. We are seeing very quickly an agenda for reform emerge. And I think that, again, is something that then needs to be worked on, because a reform proposal is not yet a reform solution. So a lot of technical work has to happen there. And so, particularly from a perspective, if I speak from as UNDP, we view this as an opportunity to bring the best of what a country and the international community can bring to the challenge of financing. And that is why also the SDG fund put forward these grants that allowed us to work simultaneously in 65 countries now in supporting this. And I think that the partnership, the facility, is a way in which we can reinforce that. And ultimately, the success criteria will be, I think, twofold. Do these platforms have a life beyond the initial moment in which they are now being convened? And in many countries, they're actually being regularized, or existing platforms are being evolved and adapted. This is a very good sign. And secondly, obviously, are we going to see more capital flow? And that is something that we're obviously all going to monitor very carefully. And for the international community, I think it is also the opportunity to look at concessional finance, grant financing, really being integrated in a more coherent national set of priorities. So if it works well, everybody will be a winner here, which is not something we can say very often at the moment in the world as we look at it.
As promised, Minister Ariana, I'm gonna come back to you, and we just, sort of heard a little bit about, this coordination. I see we also have a question sort of about how can these INFFs be coordinated? How can you really use them to mobilize resources and really align the financing that you do have with sustainable development? So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your experience and how you think you can sort of use the INFF process to mobilize greater capital for all those different sort of rainbow of priorities and angles that you were talking about earlier. And how do you think the facility itself could help support you through that?
Sure. I think that the first part is to really map the needs very well. And in a country that doesn't have so many resources, the other part is like, where do you finance that? And you find quite a lot of opportunities, although in this programming in specific, we're in the early stages. We see a lot of opportunities in the market. For example, for Ecuador, for the Galapagos Reserve, we were looking at a blue bond that we have been working with different investors. And that's something that it's still in the beginning of trying to structuring. Is not that easy, but how can you finance that in the long term? How can you do some liability management? How can you save the country some interest rates, and with that differential, how can you pay the reserve, the reserve that you can, the ocean reserve that you have there, the expenses of that. So that's one way to do it. Another is, for example, in the Amazon, we are looking at a corridor, try to conserve that ecological corridor, serve in the same fashion. And in the past years, we have some social bonds that we're able to finance some of the initiatives that we have here in Ecuador, some of the cash transfers that you have. So that's what we are looking at. And in general, I think for a country like Ecuador, always looking at this financing is going to be interesting, since we feel like we have, or actually we have some assets that you can think about, natural reserve assets that we can conserve. And with the support of the multilaterals, I think you need to sort of push that to the fullest extent. You have a lot of opportunities, a lot of technical assistance that you can have in very specific things. But in general, as I said, we are at the beginning of this process, but it's, how do you find the needs? How do you cost that? Articulate and plan everything together in the government, map the resources, and put, some structure of governance around that. And that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. Really, really interesting to hear how you're looking at that. And I'll certainly be interested to watch and look out for some of that work that you mentioned, including about a blue bond for the Galapagos. It sounds like a really interesting financing tool. I want to turn back to Minister Haydarov next, and we heard Achim Steiner mention the SDG bond, and Uzbekistan issued one of the first SDG bonds, certainly in the region, but more broadly. And can you tell us a little bit about that process of issuing this SDG bond, and what role the INFF played in facilitating the creation of the bond, and in linking it to sort of your broader financing for development?
Thank you, Edward, for your questions. Indeed, Uzbekistan became one of the first countries in the region to issue SDG bonds. That was a major advance both in development finance and our commitment to SDGs. The story started in November 2020 when Uzbekistan issued historic Eurobonds denominated in national currency, equivalent to approximately $200 million. The proceeds from the transaction, government of Uzbekistan directed for development projects aligned with several national SDGs. In fact, this was a trigger that created new opportunity for the government and UNDP to strengthen collaboration. The findings of development finance assessment, which I have mentioned earlier, called the for better alignment with the SDGs, and the high development impact of government investment programs. In 2021, within the framework of the INFF initiative, with the support of UNDP, we have developed a new bond framework that enabled us to align the use of proceeds to specific metrics and the SDG indicators, as well as to indicate the due diligence of implemented projects. This would also ensure better transparency and accountability of the whole process. One of the important outcomes of such collaboration has become leveraging additional financing worth of $230 million for SDG-aligned national projects. SDG bond facilitated financing of public programs in 7 areas. First is education, water management, health, green transportation, pollution control, management of natural resources, and green energy. In fact, these are areas which have been high on government's agenda: reducing pollution, tackling dry climate, water scarcity, maintaining reliable energy supply are a few cases that we have SDG domain. Last year, we launched nationwide 5-year Yashil Makan initiative to plant trees across the country and preserve natural resources. Such activities increasingly require the mobilization of both public and the private capital, which we intend to harness through innovative financial instruments such green bond, blended finance, and green scoop, and others. In this regard, INFF is playing a role of main institutional vehicle to integrate sustainability consideration in this process. INFF is helping us better manage such a diverse development financing landscape and finance national development priorities and SDGs in a coherent manner. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think you've answered one of the questions that came up in the chat about how SDG goals are sort of incorporated in the INFF framework. So I don't know if you saw that, but you preemptively answered someone's question. So I appreciate that. Liu Zhenmin, I want to turn back to you. We know that there are a lot of different partners who can provide capacity support on sustainable financing. But one of the challenges is often sort of coordination. So I know, we've heard already that the INFF can sort of be a tool to coordinate and not duplicate efforts. So I want to learn more about UN DESA's role in bringing together different international partners to support the INFFs, and how you can really sort of use your position to bridge that financial divide and really ensure that things are best coordinated and working as well as they can be.
Thank you, Edward, for moderating this discussion. You are right. I think the overall objective of the INFF is to mobilize international partnership. So I think the INFF really could serve 3 or 4 purposes. First, really to help the developing countries in need for attracting and receiving the financing for receiving investment. So by outlining key national financing priorities, really INFF can help countries to coordinate and align the support they receive from their developed partners. This is first to help developing countries for receiving the investment. Second, and I think to be helped to mobilize the support from partners, especially developed partners. Luckily, I think that this INFF already been endorsed by the G20 leaders. With the G20 leaders, they endorsed the G20 framework for voluntary support to integrate national financial frameworks. I think this is one of the big achievement over the past year, that we have this INFF has been endorsed for support by the G20 leaders. Third, I think, of course, for finance for development, really, especially successful financing for SDGs, will also depend on the enhanced global cooperation. In addition to the public financing, we also need to mobilize private financing and blended financing, and all kinds of financing. So, but I believe that the INFF can be helpful as they allow countries to identify not only support needs, but also policy asks for global processes. So they can help to the other partners or potential investors to understand what these developing countries need. I think we started in that approach. So DESA is a convener of the Intelligence Task Force on Financing for Development, which is this task force I'm chairing in my capacity of the USG of DESA. We developed this INFF, and we started this pioneer process. So we should continue. That's why I think today's launch of this the INFF facility is very timely. So today, confronting the new challenges caused by the Ukrainian crisis, the world is really confronting the three urgent response for food crisis, energy crisis, and the financial crisis. So we need to be more tailored response to these crises. That's why we need to invest in a sustainable, resilient, and equitable recovery. So everything should be done to facilitate the global recovery. DESA's work at the global level helps to shape normative frameworks in which countries can effectively operate. I think we're supporting the General Assembly, we're supporting the ECOSOC process, including the current Financing for Development Forum. So of course, we're also coordinating the Intelligence Task Force on Financing for Development, which includes around 60 agencies within UN system and beyond, including OECD. So DESA will continue to use our community power to bring together international partners to support INFF, urging collective action to more coherent approaches to finance sustainable development and 2030 agenda. Of course, we are also in the process to mobilize climate financing to mitigate the climate change challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to go to Deputy Secretary General Schlagenhoff. We're in a position today where countries are looking at, increasing financing gaps. They're also often dealing with heightened and rising debt risks. And at the same time, they're trying to align financing with the SDGs. And they are calling for support to address all of these issues, which are sort of happening at the same time. How do you think the INFF facility can help in addressing this call from countries about these mounting?
I think that it's a simple fact that if we're going to finance a just and sustainable recovery in developing countries, we're going to need further financial innovation. However, we need to be very careful because this innovation needs to come with technical assistance and capacity building so that all countries can benefit from it. While recovery and Build Back Better efforts have the potential to boost sustainable finance innovation, there is a risk that higher non-financial reporting standards will divert resources from developing countries and increase the SDGs financing gap unless it comes with assistance to develop comparable SDG compatible bankable projects in developing countries. I mentioned earlier the risk posed by the profusion of financing actors and instruments in the financing for development landscape. In recent years, fiscal vulnerabilities have emerged as a top-level concern due to rising debt levels in developing countries. The experience of a growing number of countries shows that failure to properly assess the risk-return trade-off of new instruments can lead to situations of debt distress. And certainly, exogenous factors like the COVID-19 crisis and the war in Ukraine are only adding to the financing risk that are faced by developing countries. A key role in the INFF facility will be to ensure that this entry into an age of choice for development finance does not lead to unsustainable financing strategies. The INFF facility could significantly improve countries' access to financing in the medium to long term by providing well-targeted technical assistance and capacity building in key areas. These include better screening of investment and financing opportunities, the design and the deployment of innovative financing solutions, and the development of a pipeline of SDG-compatible bankable projects and support to access green funds. The return on the technical support provided through this new innovative facility could be significant. For instance, in the case of the joint UNDP OECD Tax Inspectors Without Borders Initiative, or TIWB, that relies on a similar pool mechanism, drawing on technical expertise from OECD DAC members. Every dollar invested results in $100 of additional tax return for developing countries. We're at a strategic crossroad to harness effective partnerships in support of the 23 Agenda and Addis Ababa Action Agenda as the world confronts successive crises with crippling impact on developing countries' prospects to achieve the SDGs. This facility provides a way for our members to empower countries to design and implement their own development finance strategies. We hope the launch of the facility will be a milestone in the mobilization of development partners in developing countries in support of INFFs. We need to build on the momentum of last year's endorsement by the G20. At the OECD, we stand ready to continue working with all of you to leverage financing, knowledge, and expertise from our members to meet the growing demand for technical assistance on INFF development and implementation.
Great. Thank you. I really want to thank all of our speakers on this first panel for helping us to understand more about the INFF process and to launch this new facility. I think we've learned a little bit about sort of how the facility has been working so far and gotten some really interesting perspectives from Ecuador and Uzbekistan about how they're approaching the process and the tools that they're developing to both bring in public and private capital to really address and align with their needs. And you know, I think we've learned a little bit about how the facility can help countries to both learn from each other, build partnerships, and access the technical support that many of them might need to implement some of the plans and this INFF process in general. So we're going to move shortly to our second panel discussion. We're going to learn a little bit more from some additional partners and about the INFF facility and from additional countries to get their perspectives. I want to start with a short video from policymakers sort of talking about the INFFs from their perspectives. So we'll go to that video and then we'll come back and I'll introduce our panelists for the second panel.
Like most countries today, we are at a crossroads, at a critical juncture.
Given the increased SDGs financing gap, particularly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, it is imperative for us to establish the most optimal sustainable financing pathway to meet the SDGs achievement.
Cambodia will have to expand and diversify its source of financing for development and strengthen its planning instrument and mechanism.
To highly prioritize domestic revenue mobilization, deploy digital solution and financial literacy, transform informal economy to increase private sector contribution.
По сокращению бедности минимум в 2 раза, созданию новых рабочих мест, включение Узбекистана в страну с высоким уровнем дохода.
To improve national competitiveness, economic growth and income distribution while accelerating climate action and energy transition.
big challenge to draw all the finances that would be required to attain all the targets stated in the SDGs.
By 2030 or earlier, we should have a functioning national financing framework to sustainably address financing gaps.
I will define an INFF as an arrangement that presents us a range of opportunities and options to mobilize the resources we need.
Partnerships, it has innovative financing, it has skills on prioritizing and identifying the innovative ways of bringing all financing streams on board.
It's a framework which brings together government, private sector, civil society, and development partners.
In raising awareness of SDG-aligned development financing priorities and sparking important discussions.
Todos los recursos, tanto del sector público como del sector privado, nos deben alcanzar esos objetivos que nos hemos puesto como país, esa Agenda 2030.
Le Gabon a consenti d'énormes efforts, mobilisé des ressources, quelques ressources, fiscalité verte, les questions de partenariat public-privé. Nous regardons également la question de la comptabilité verte.
So we are expanding financing opportunities.
We have issued the SDGs bonds, the first in Southeast Asia.
The INFF project is creating opportunities like investor mapping, digital trade platforms,
including reforms that are aimed at mainstreaming gender across fiscal policies.
A monitoring and evaluation framework and coordination structure embedded with our public financial management system.
The Integrated National Financial Framework is being developed at the most opportune and strategic period for a new approach to financing national priorities.
Өмнөх энэ алтаг битгий тавтаарай. Энэ үндэсний санхүүжилтийн нэгдсэн тогтолцоог хөгжүүлээд
This while getting the broadest number of sectors to join us in our journey towards shaping the future that we want.
To further refine and develop policy recommendations for financing the 2030 agenda to achieve the future our people very well deserve.
Great. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists for this discussions about really how countries can use the INFF platform to scale SDG financing. So joining us for this discussion, we have Marietta Jager, who's the Deputy Director General of DG International Partnership with the European Union. From the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, we have Alan Atkinson, who's the Assistant Director General. And we have Ambassador Fabio Cassese, the Director General for Development Cooperation from Italy. And really also looking forward to hearing a few country perspectives. In this panel, we have Dr. Charles Mwamwaja, who is the Commissioner for Financial Sector Development in Tanzania, where the INFF process is advancing a financial strategy, and they have some initial reforms underway that I hope we'll get to hear about. And to tell us about the strategy and reforms that are being taken forward in Mongolia, we have Sonor Lufsandorj, who's the Director of Financial Markets and Insurance Division at the Ministry of Finance in Mongolia. And to close out our panel, we'll have Catherine Baer, the Deputy Director of IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, who's going to share her perspective at an IFI, an international financial institution, and sort of how they're looking at engaging with INFFs and the INFF process. So Deputy Director General Jager, I wanted to start with you. The EU has been a champion of this INFF process since the Addis Ababa agenda was adopted. Can you give us a little bit of background about the EU's support for INFFs, why the EU sort of engaged and thought that the INFFs would bring something sort of new and valuable to SDG financing?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this question, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really pleased to be with you today and to address you. Let me reply to your question, saying that country-led integrated national financing framework are essential for accelerating the progress towards SDGs. And that's why, as a real believer, the EU, since the beginning, has been a strong supporter of INFFs. So we also believe that they strongly contribute to the recovery and, of course, momentum behind the INFFs presents a huge opportunity to transform national financial system. Also, we can manage better the risk and, of course, make countries more resilient to shocks. And in today's world of pandemics, conflicts, and climate crisis, we all know that we need a new framework for challenging investments to where it is needed most. And of course, to leverage the investments and to bring in the private sector. And we believe that integrated approach is key, and more than 80 countries have recognized that as well, and they are developing INFFs. So therefore, I would like to say on behalf of the EU that we are excited to join UNDP, UNDESA, and OECD together with the government of Italy and Sweden to launch the INFF Technical Assistance Facility. And of course, we can add that our commitment that we will continue to actively support the financing for sustainable development, even in the future, in very many ways. Let me just share with you 3 initiatives. First, our Investing in Sustainable Development report that has just been published offers a stock taking on the implementation of the Addis Ababa Action Plan agenda and shows really that integrated approaches to financing are crucial. So that is one reason we are supporting it. And secondly, we have launched a Global Gateway, a European strategy for the investment in sustainable, in high quality infrastructure projects with more than 300 billion that we would like to mobilize until 27 in the priority areas such as transport, energy, health, education, and together with our member states and European financial institutions, we will do everything to implement that and to seek also to mobilize the private sector. We have many tools, including the new EFSD Plus, and that brings me to the third point that EU is preparing a comprehensive strategies to scale up the sustainable finance in low and middle income countries to accelerate the flow of private capital towards a sustainable investment. And I would like to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, that 22 is a crucial year. As INFF progress, there is a really growing demand from the countries for the technical support to deliver on these promises, and we need to work together in partnership to deliver. It is really about supporting the people working hard to finance the future in more greener, more inclusive, and more sustainable way. And I'm confident that the facility that we are launching today will be really instrumental tool in this respect, and that we will deliver together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Charles Mwantha, I want to turn to you next, and I want to hear about how the INFF process is working in Tanzania, what you've seen as the benefits of using the process, and how Tanzania is going to use support from the facility to sort of really realize the potential of the INFF and to carry that forward.
Well, thank you very much, organizers. On behalf of the Minister of Finance and Planning and the government of Tanzania, we are very much thankful to get this opportunity of attending this important discussion. Well, in Tanzania, just like any other countries in the world, we have been facing a number of challenges, and especially with the current pandemic, which had hit the world very much. But also we are working towards a number of initiatives that we want to achieve. And most importantly is that we are working towards the implementation of the 5-year development plan 3. The 5-year development plan 3 is a third in terms of the implementation. In fact, we had a longer-term development plan, which we had implemented 2 phases of national development plans, and now we are operating the 3rd one, which has a time frame of 5-year time frame. Now, in that plan, the government aspires to undertake a number of development initiatives, including that will be geared towards industrialization and human development. And as you read that plan, you will find that we have made a projection in terms of the resource envelope that we want to have in order to achieve whatever that we have planned. And in that, you will find that we have projections of about 110 Tanzanian trillion shillings, out of which we envisage to get about 70 from the public and about 40 from the private sector. And so in Tanzania, we have had a number of discussions and the engagement with the development partners, but also the private sector, CSOs, NGOs, and a number of some other important stakeholders on how we can go about raising this amount, about the 40 trillion shillings, which is required in the implementation of the 3rd 5-year development plan 3. And so when it comes to the INFFF, we are finding this to be a great opportunity because all along, especially in emerging economies, you will find that most of the time, it is the government that has been financing to a great extent almost everything in terms of development projects. So in this aspect then, I think it is much more ideal because with the INFF, we are also trying to explore innovative ways of financing. And this is a great avenue for mobilizing resources. For example, in Tanzania, we had done an assessment of the financial landscaping, and we found that the financial systems are well in order to accommodate this. And currently, we're in the process of working on the credit sovereign rating so that we can as well attract much more investors globally as well. So this INFF we are finding to be very ideal, and it has come at the right moment because we are finding that the government alone cannot be in a position to finance all the development projects as have been highlighted in the 5-year development plan. But again, we are finding this to be a great opportunity of working together with the private sector, bringing them on board, especially as we are trying to look at the different financial instruments that will be issuing in the market. We are planning to go for the bonds of different types. We are planning to go for some other instruments like green financing, blue financing, and some other things. So in Tanzania, we are of the opinion that this is a great opportunity and it has come at the appropriate time. But the only thing which you have to do now, because it is something which is recent and probably it requires some kind of much more expertise, especially in terms of preparing the bankable projects. And this is really very important, especially when you are considering innovative ways of financing. You need to do proper documentation. You need to prepare your feasibility studies well good, and some other essential papers so that a project document is well complete and can attract the investors. So we think that this is a great opportunity, and we look forward to working towards with a number of stakeholders to make sure that this thing is feasible. In terms of the sovereign, that is something which we are working on, but in terms of corporate bonds, that is something which we have been doing for some time. We have issued some sukuk bonds, some corporate bonds, but really we are aspiring for something bigger in terms of something that will be able to raise adequate revenue to finance projects as indicated which will be in line with the SDGs. I think that is something which I can share from Tanzania. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Mamwaja, for those insights. It would be really interesting to see how things are carried forward. Alan Atkinson, I want to bring you in. We've had some questions about sort of how INFF can be a tool of coordination and ensure that there isn't duplication. I'm curious how CETA sort of is using the INFF tools, participating in it, how you think it enhances the work that you're already doing at a country level, and what's sort of exciting to you about it? What solutions are sort of the most interesting to you? And yeah, let's start with that.
Thanks so much, Adva. And it's such a pleasure to be here and great to see all these wonderful colleagues, excellencies and partners. CETA's engagement with the Addis Agenda, which we're all trying to achieve, partly now through the agency of these new INFF tools and the facility. It's building an hour-long history of engagement with development finance. And when the Addis Agenda launched, CETA, like many other actors, we began a process of what has essentially become a continuous stepping up of the level of ambition that we have and that we believe everybody needs to have to achieve these goals. Reflected in the number of projects that seek to catalyze new and innovative forms for financing for development, how to make the best use of ODA funds, limited ODA funds to mobilize public and private resources, all with the aim of increasing development impact. And we now have a relatively broad range of tools in this regard, but our participation in the INFF facility here signals that this is really a step up in the global game. The guarantee instrument is one of our most visible tools, I'm sure. Many people around the table will be familiar with. We have a mandate to issue guarantees against the Swedish state's balance sheet, have the authority now to guarantee loans up to a volume of about 21 billion Swedish crowns. And that's a great tool that allows us to support businesses and entrepreneurs, women-owned businesses, developing countries to access capital more easily. But it also facilitates larger scale institutional investments aimed at reducing poverty. And the aim here, of course, is to generate very high multipliers for every krona that we have of development aid. And we use a number of other market-driven approaches to achieve that: challenge funds, reverse auctions. It's a complicated puzzle. The INFF is, of course, a new tool that allows all the countries working to achieve these goals to lay that puzzle in a much more coherent and systematic fashion. From our side, we're continuing to build a sense of how to rig our own ambition level. And these are challenging times, of course, but we've been working, for example, in our turf here in Sweden. We organized an a national network of investors, insurance companies, wealth funds, asset managers, working in partnership to catalyze investments in the SDGs. And that in turn inspired the establishment of partly the Global Investors for Sustainable Development in 2019, convened by the UN Secretary-General and coordinated by our colleagues at UN DESA, with many others here involved in that process. And all of these initiatives together, of course, are ways of encouraging investors, the international community, to work together in this regard. In our work, we continuously and constantly emphasize the need to integrate the work to mobilize investment with institution building. And we see the establishment of this INFF facility as contributing to that process of really fostering an integrated approach, stimulating the innovation, the reforms that are necessary. We've heard our colleagues around the table already talk about how this is happening. And we at Sweden, of course, are very happy to be part of the process. And I'm sure you're eager to get on because I think you're a little behind time, Adva.
Keeping me honest. We're a few minutes behind time, but I think we'll be okay. I'll try to catch us up a little bit here. Ambassador Cassese, I want to turn to you. We've already heard that under Italy's G20 presidency last year, the INFFs were endorsed, and there was a call for further cooperation. So I wanted to hear a little bit about Italy's involvement in the facility and sort of how you look to bring forward that work and how you're going to look to align the work of your embassies and delegations with other partners to ensure sort of the maximum impact. Ambassador, you are muted. Can you unmute for us?
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Saldinger. I'm very pleased to stay together with you to launch this initiative. As you know, we are confronted today with multiple crises resulting with the dramatic increase in inequality in the world, with additional 77 million people living in extreme poverty, and developing countries struggling for recovering from COVID-19 pandemic, and the SDGs suffering a setback in many of these countries. These considerations brought us to place sustainable development at the core of the G20 presidency's processes last year. In addressing setbacks of the implementation of the Agenda 2030, we prioritized the integrated national financing frameworks within financing for development. These coordinated policies were discussed at the first ever G20 development ministerial meeting in Matera and concluded with the political endorsement of INFFs by the G20 leaders at the Rome summit last October. I'm very proud that under the Italian presidency, G20 efforts have intensively contributed to the launching of the INFFs facility, as marked by this important gathering today. This launching is a major political achievement for the international community and for developing countries. It also creates the opportunity to forge a collaborative vision and a strategic and fruitful partnership on INFFs to assist partner countries in their quest for coherence and alignment of national sustainable development plans, financial strategies, and the SDGs at the country level. To this end, we decided last year to support also financially this facility, and today I renew Italy's interest in leveraging this political momentum to facilitate the expansion and the use of this valuable platform in the years to come, also through our participation in the governance structure. This year, we will also use Italy's role as a member of the G20 Troika to continue facilitating the synergies between the INFFs facility implementation and discussion in the G20 Development Working Group on reviewing progress at the country level on INFFs and continue build awareness through dialogue. The establishment of this facility is a unique opportunity to accelerate the SDGs achievement by developing countries, as well as supporting them through a coordinated cooperation to address impacts of the twin crises of the pandemic and of the war in Ukraine by building an inclusive and resilient recovery. Italy is ready to join donors, international organizations, and key stakeholders to facilitate this ambitious goal, while recognizing the importance of partners' countries' ownership and leadership in operationalizing the 5 key priorities areas of INFFs. We regard these elements as the hallmark of this approach. Achieving effective programmatic results requires that actions are strengthened at the country level by an effective partnership and collaboration. We believe that building a whole of society approach is central to ensure that the strategic and policy responses developed through the INFF reflects the stakeholders' needs. It also provides an opportunity to build a shared sense of ownership over the INFFs. We also consider important to help partner countries in identifying intermediate impacts within INFFs that will demonstrate progress in resource mobilization and alignment, while maintaining a focus and building momentum for longer-term reforms. In fact, Italy is assisting developing countries in the implementation of their national development reforms and plans by engaging them in a constructive dialogue to define main policy components of the programmatic annual cycle of the Italian development cooperation. In this process, we see great benefit from opportunities and contributions emerging from the work that this facility will be implementing to build inclusive, multi-stakeholder approaches, provide capacity development, share knowledge and experiences, and promote alignment and coordination. Finally, in conclusion, the Agenda 2030 is pressing for a greater coherence of the financing for sustainable development, and Italy, through its embassies and through its offices of the Italian Agents for Development Cooperation in the field, is committed to such a path which the INFF facility is expected to facilitate and advance at the local level. So thank you very much, and we are ready to continue cooperating with all of you. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to turn next to Director Lusandorj. I'd like to learn a little bit more about how the government of Mongolia has put in place some of these strategies, reforms, and instruments to mobilize finance, both towards your national development priorities and to the SDGs. So tell me a little bit about that process in Mongolia and how the process has helped you bring together different stakeholders to align on these development priorities and accelerate finance.
Thank you very much for the question. So greetings to all of the participants, excellencies, and panelists. So I'm very pleased to be attending this important event and sharing Mongolia's experience. So as you mentioned, we are in the process of developing the INFF and finalizing the financing strategy for our medium-term development plan. So we've worked in collaboration with the EU, IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and other stakeholders like the private sector. So this process has been very beneficial to us as we were able to build on and accelerate the ongoing reforms. So it helped to
Director Lusandorj, I think we may have lost our connection. Give you a minute, and if not, we can try to get you back. I can move on to our next speaker. Let's do that. Hopefully we'll be able to get Director Lusandorj back, because I'm curious to hear more and learn where he was going. But in the meantime, I'd like to turn to Catherine Baer, the Deputy Director of Fiscal Affairs Department at IMF. IMF is looking at the development of INFF guidance, and your work is sort of critical to many of the reforms that are taking place within this country-led process. So tell me a little bit how IMF's tools and capacity development is complementing and responding to the priorities that countries are articulating through this INFF process.
Adva, thank you very much. Just confirming that you can see me and hear me fine.
See you and hear you just great.
Very well, thank you. Well, first, it's an honor to be here this morning and join this launch event of the INFF facility. Let me make a few general remarks before getting to the question you asked me, Adva. So first, and some of these echo what we have heard this morning or today, certainly the COVID pandemic and its economic repercussions are setting back progress made so far toward achieving the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Gains in poverty reduction over the last decade could be reversed in a worrisome development. Our estimates conducted before COVID-19 showed that most emerging market economies could finance the additional spending needed to achieve the SDGs through domestic actions, as we heard before, while most low-income developing countries needed significant additional financing, including by the private sector and development partners. The latest analytical work in 2021 examined 4 case study countries and found that these countries may need additional annual spending of over 14% of GDP on average to reach the SDGs by 2030. This is some 2.5 percentage points above the pre-pandemic estimate. Furthermore, the war in Ukraine has exacerbated pandemic-induced supply chain disruptions and increased volatility of energy and food prices. This will impair growth across regions and further reduce fiscal space for financing the SDGs. This deteriorating situation is leaving most low-income developing countries and emerging market economies with higher financing needs, limited domestic resources, and higher debt levels, making the ambitious SDG timeline even more daunting. Meeting the financing needs requires concerted efforts. In particular, domestic reforms are critically important. The focus should be on the following areas. First, boosting economic growth through structural reforms and improved efficiency of spending. Second, through domestic revenue mobilization. That means gradually increasing tax to GDP ratios through comprehensive tax policy and tax administration reforms as the crisis subsides. And third, as we've also heard today, by attracting more private financing for development, improving the business environment, and strengthening institutions. In this regard, the IMF remains committed to supporting countries in their effort to pursue the SDGs. Our areas of support include the following, and I'll briefly highlight 3 broad areas. First, diagnostic tools and policy advice to manage public debt and investment, address economic inclusion, meaning income inequality, gender disparities, and financial inclusion, tackling climate change challenges, including mitigation and building resilience to disasters, and designing appropriate fiscal and monetary policies to support COVID recovery and limit the scarring effect. A second broad area is lending to provide targeted financing to low-income developing countries, fragile and conflict-affected states, and countries hit by natural or public health disasters. And third, capacity development. And here the IMF's focus is on strengthening revenue mobilization capacity in both the short and medium term, enhancing medium-term budget frameworks, including by aligning public financial management with the SDGs, notably through SDG, gender, and climate budgeting, assessing the spending needs and financing strategies for reaching the SDGs, improving infrastructure governance, and boosting key statistical capabilities for more reliable socioeconomic data. All of this support is linked to progressing the INFFs, complementing the efforts of other development partners. In terms of further collaboration at the country level, one of the potential areas would be the second part of the 4-block model of INFFs, financing strategy. Among others, the IMF has provided a wide range of capacity development on revenue mobilization, as I mentioned earlier, based on the formulation and implementation of medium-term revenue strategies. We support country authorities to improve tax policy formulation and revenue administration in the short and medium terms. These efforts should contribute directly to designing the financing strategy for SDGs via the INFFs. The donor community has an important role to play to collaborate further to help fill most of the remaining financing gap. The UN target for official development assistance is 0.7% of GNI. And so far, donor financing pre-pandemic had been about half of that. Without additional external financing, SDGs would be delayed by a decade or more on average. To finish, let me congratulate our UN colleagues and express our gratitude for the launch of the INFF facility today. This is a great opportunity for all of us to enhance our collaboration to support countries in achieving the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm happy to say that we have Director Lufsandor back with us, so I'll send things back over to you. We lost you at sort of a really interesting moment where you were filling us in on your process. So I'll let you continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Apologies for this. There were some technical difficulties and I dropped off. So I was mentioning that we've been drafting the INFF in collaboration with all of the stakeholders, including the UNDP, EU, IMF, World Bank, ADB, and the private sector. So the process has been very beneficial to us as we were able to build on and accelerate the ongoing reforms. It really helped us to unlock more resource mobilization opportunities and create partnerships and reach various stakeholders. So let me just give you some examples to illustrate. So Mongolia has been piloting the results-based SDG-aligned budgeting for the past 2 to 3 years as part of the public finance management reform. So through the INFF process, we were also able to expand the pilot from 2 ministries to 4 ministries this year. So we've also been started to introduce the SDG audits so that we can properly evaluate the budget performance and the SDG alignment. Now, through this process, we've also conducted costing of the SDG targets, which showed the largest gaps for financing in the infrastructure projects. So to finance the large-scale development projects, we've drafted a new public-private partnership law to enable the leveraging of and to move away from the public finance dominant model. Last October, as part of your question, we established a multi-stakeholder platform on sustainable development. It is chaired by the Parliamentary Subcommittee on Sustainable Development, which means that the discussion is on sustainable finance is taking place at a much higher decision-making level, at a much more frequent rate, so involving wider range of actors. Now, another example of the development is the SDG finance taxonomy. Now, the Central Bank of Mongolia supports this initiative and included it in their 2022 monetary policy guideline to promote sustainable investment in loans. So we have published ESG and sustainability reporting guidance in April to align the operations of over 200 publicly listed companies with $2 billion market capitalization with sustainability principles. Now, the INFF process has been timely for us due to the pandemic. We are exploring various reforms in innovative financing instruments, as mentioned previously during the panel, like the SDG bonds and the debt for climate swap. So during the last COP26 meeting, Mongolia pledged to plant 1 billion trees to combat the climate change. And we have set up a private sector-led multi-stakeholder fund to mobilize the financing for this initiative. So the reforms within the INFF, we see it as a overarching and encompassing various financing flows from public to private sector. So we see that the INFF is a continuous self-improving process and the framework for cooperation. We do not see it as an end goal, and we have a lot to gain from this experience. So being cognizant of time, in the end, I would like to thank the UN Joint SDG Fund for supporting this great initiative in Mongolia through your
Well, it looks like we may have lost him again, but I think we got the majority of what he was telling us, and really interesting work that Mongolia is doing. And now it's to me to close us out. I think this has been a really wonderful discussion, and I really want to thank all of our speakers for joining us today, for sharing their insights about the INFF process and what the facility might bring. I want to thank all of you for joining us online and being with us for this launch of the facility. I've been really interested to hear how Uzbekistan, Ecuador, Tanzania, and just now Mongolia are using these INFFs to strengthen their financing, to do financial planning, to make reforms. And, you know, really, it's an interesting approach to mobilize public and private capital and really to align financing with the SDGs. And as many of our speakers have said, also to put in place necessary governance around that financing. In Tanzania, we heard about sort of the strategic added value and so how the platform is helping reforms move forward. We heard about, you know, some private financing. We heard about the launch of SDG bonds. We learned just now from Mongolia about some of their budgeting, the ability to do SDG audits, the look at, you know, how the central bank can be involved in terms of setting this taxonomy around SDGs and sustainability. And we've heard from international partners from the EU who supported this process from the beginning, since ADIS, to how SIDA is sort of looking at incorporating this in the work that it's doing. You know, last year we heard from Italy about, you know, sort of how to move forward this support from the G20, which was sort of put forward during its presidency last year, and importantly from the IMF about how its sort of plans and policies and the way it works with countries can work alongside the INFF process. I think hopefully many of you have sort of taken away from this the sense of opportunity that these INFFs can represent. I believe there's about 40 that are, you know, coming to a close in the year ahead. And I would be remiss if I said that, you know, we didn't, you know, we live in these extraordinarily challenging times. The pandemic dealt a real blow for the progress of SDGs, and we saw that increase financing gaps. And of course, you know, the war in Ukraine today and conflict elsewhere on top of the climate crisis and rising inequalities. And today we're seeing rising food prices and energy crisis, and all these challenges create an outlook that is full of risk and uncertainty, and really puts a premium on ensuring that financing is available and that limited pools of financing are used most effectively and efficiently to achieve these goals and address some of the ongoing crises. It does mean that, you know, financing the 2030 objectives will be harder, but it is really interesting to see how countries are using these INFFs to sort of set their own ambitious plans and bring together public and private finance to support and work on the SDGs. So I'm really curious to look ahead to see what type of capital is mobilized, to look at, you know, how financial systems shift, how they can be coordinated using this process, and how they can drive investment for a greener, more inclusive and sustainable future. You know, ensuring that these frameworks actually succeed and realize their potential is a difficult job, and a key piece to achieving that seems to be partnerships. So it's been really interesting to hear from a number of different sort of actors and partners today. I think it's also will be interesting to see how countries really learn from one another as they move forward in this process. So I want to thank you all again for joining us today for the launch of the INFF facility. And I hope that you'll stay engaged with the INFF process as we move forward. Thank you so much for joining us today.